next speaker is a leading national expert on African American youth, youth activism, and youth development. He's an associate professor of education in Africana Studies in the Africana Studies Department and senior research associate for the Cesar Chavez Institute for Public Policy at the San Francisco State University. Actually, Shawn spoke at the first How Kids Learn conference, and we asked him to come back to share his perspective on the importance of character education and social emotional learning and the forms that they can take on or take in serving the needs of the youth that he works with. So please help me welcome Shawn Ginwright.
Greetings, greetings. It's good to be here. I'm usually a skeptic when I hear a bunch of news on the radio, and so I didn't really think it was going to be a bad storm. So don't start the time yet. I want to share this story. Yeah. So my wife is like, I don't know if you should go. Call Sam and cancel and tell him you're not going to go. I'm like, oh, it's not going to be that bad. It's not going to be that bad. So I woke up this morning because it was raining pretty hard, and I live in Oakland, and get dressed, get ready, open my garage door. As I pull out the car, there's a big damn tree laying in my driveway. So I'm going, oh, how am I going to get there? There's literally a tree blocking me from getting out of my driveway. So this is a true story. So I get up, get my shears, and start cutting the tree back this morning. Just enough. That's perseverance. Just enough so I could ease the car back so I could get on the freeway and here on time. It's a true story. So it's really good to be here. I am here. Y'all should text my wife and tell her he came anyway. So I'm here to talk about the limits and possibilities for social emotional learning for young people in urban communities and throughout our society. I think that in some ways I feel a little uneasy here because I do have some questions about the limits and possibilities for social emotional learning. For a number of years, I've worked with African American and Latino youth, largely working with them to support them around the kinds of issues they face in their communities: exposure to violence, exposure to trauma, exposure to a number of issues that shape the quality of their school day. And what I found over the past 20 years is that there are a number of factors that contribute to the healthy development of African American and Latino young people. So about 6 months ago, my wife and I and my kids were in my living room, and my wife had recommended a movie that we should watch because in many ways the work that we do can get kind of draining. And she put on the television and we watched this movie called Happy. Has anybody seen Happy? It's a great movie, documentary. And so the documentary's premise is really about how is it that despite the conditions that people face in their lives, despite the kinds of issues that they face, how is it that they can sustain themselves with a sense of peace, joy, and happiness? I think that the message of Happy is a pretty profound and compelling argument. And so the documentary shows a number of poor families. This is a family in India. And they show that this family in India has very little money. They have children, and they show them in the streets, and they show them having fun. They show them working. They show them together. And the message that the movie suggests is that, again, what matters most in life is our capacity to connect with family, our capacity to love, our capacity to be together. There's another story that they use about a family in New Orleans, in Louisiana, that lives lives in the Everglades. And they show them catching shrimp and sitting on the porch and sharing warm stories and drinking a beer. And again, that the outer conditions of life don't matter. And so we went to bed that night pretty inspired, right? But as I went to bed, I began to wonder what other story was not being told in the movie Happy. And I wondered because I understand that the consequences of poverty are significant. And so I wondered, for example, what kind of conditions could actually threaten or at least threaten or mitigate our sense of happiness and peace. And so I wondered, for example, how conditions like this influence happiness. How much adversity actually does make a difference. Can a condition of poverty, a condition of suffering, a condition of life challenges actually mitigate and actually threaten our capacity to be happy? This work is also supported by Martin Seligman, University of Pennsylvania, who's done a number of a lot of work on this notion of happiness. In the book Flourish, he makes the argument again that the things that matter most in life, right, that psychologists really should shift their gaze from only measuring and understanding pathology, depression, and so on and so forth, but measure things like hope and aspirations. And it is in that type of psychology that we can begin to have greater outcomes, not only in our lives as adults, but also in our lives of young people. Now, some of you might think Ginwright is a happy hater, right? This song by Pharrell, right? Just Be Happy. I think that, and we also remember the song by Bobby McFerrin, Don't Worry, Be Happy, right? That these are themes in our lives, themes in our popular culture, themes in our collective memory that make us feel good, right? But these songs, I think, are also emblematic of a broader trend that suggests that the woes of the poor can be solved through a miraculous effort and profound chemical regulation of the brain. And despite the fact that we understand that there's evidence that optimism and hope and grit and all these things make a difference, the question really becomes, can we actually solve poverty through happiness? So an article you may have read in the Stanford Social Innovation Review recently made this argument. And the argument sort of went like this, that what's really important about overcoming poverty is our capacity, or poor people's capacity, to make better decisions, poor people's capacity to hope, poor people's capacity to connect with each other, poor people's capacity to have a sense of grit and perseverance. And that really poverty is not a structural issue, but that poverty is a function of people's individual capacities. And said in a different way, that in many ways that poverty is a function of a flawed character traits. So I wrote a blog back to Stanford Social Innovation Review. They didn't publish it, but my comments sort of challenged that question, which is, while we understand the necessity and the significance of character and social emotional learning, we cannot ignore the profound context in which it exists. Some of these trends can be also found in our thinking about social emotional learning. That is, this recent book by Paul Tough. Paul Tough makes the argument that he calls it the cognitive hypothesis, right? This idea that success depends primarily on cognitive skills. But what matters most is not information that we stuff into the brain, but we need things like persistence, self-control, curiosity, consciousness, grit, and self-confidence. These are the things that make a significant difference in terms of success. I don't think that we discount Paul Tough's claims, but there are some challenges with our current formulations and I think thinking about social emotional learning that simply don't place social emotional learning in the context in which young people are developing. So if we place social emotional learning in the context in which young people are developing, we have to draw on other forms of research to give us information about really what matters. This is work by Isaac Prelatinsky that says one of the most important things in terms of social emotional learning is young people's capacity to actually feel a sense of control and power in their lives. That in poor communities, the ability to feel out of control, to not have a say in the conditions, to not have a say or a voice in public policy, to not have a say on the kind of decisions that are made in school actually harms young people. If you could think about what just happened in Ferguson and Stanton, New York, how might that social political instance shape conversations in classrooms? Young people, again, Isaac Peletinsky suggests that when young people have a sense of control and power in their lives, that facilitates well-being. There are three challenges, I think, with current formulations of social-emotional learning. The first challenge is a challenge with context, and that is, how might we think about emotional regulation, empathy, social responsible decision-making when kids come to school hungry in the morning, dodge bullets during lunch, and fear the police as they walk home from school in the afternoon? The question is, how much grit and social-emotional learning makes a difference when nothing around you changes? The question is how much adversity actually makes a difference? So when we think about adversity and perseverance, how much? What type of adversity? So there's a difference between adversity and suffering. Adversity might be those things that make life a little more difficult. That you can talk to a friend, that you can have a relationship with your teacher, but suffering is a different thing. Suffering is an internal psycho-spiritual condition that young people experience. It's the sense that I am hopeless and there's nothing that I can do that actually makes a difference in the quality of my life. And so when we talk about social-emotional learning, we have to put it in that context. How do we think about social-emotional learning in the context of suffering? In the context when young people see news reports about Ferguson, in the context when we think about the issues of Oscar Grant, the context of what we see in Stanton, New York. These are the kind of social and political issues that call to question the kind of social-emotional learning that's important. The second challenge of social-emotional learning is culture. Janie Ward suggests that the ability for young people to affirmatively talk about their racial and ethnic identity is in fact an important protective factor in a society that views them otherwise. For African American young people, for my daughter who's 13 years old, to not feel good about being a black woman, to not feel good about her kinky hair, to not feel good about her thick lips is in fact a damage to her social-emotional states. So when we think about social-emotional learning, we put it in context. That is, it's one thing to have healthy conversations with young people, but we also have to have healthy conversations about race, about ethnicity, and about the cultural environment in which they live. The third challenge is a challenge of focus. Social-emotional learning tends, because it comes out of sort of educational psychology, that the challenge of focus presumes that the change is at the individual level. In the African American and Latino and many indigenous communities, there is a collectivity, right? There's the idea that I am not well until we are well. I am not well until we are well. And so that my son, who is 16 years old, might feel good about himself, but his consciousness is that his friends might be harassed when they come home from school. And that the friends that he hangs around with, that there's a collective consciousness about the conditions of other African-American young people. And so the three challenges with social-emotional learning, context, culture, and focus, I think we need to take up and understand how to place it in these contexts. We did a study on social-emotional learning. We wanted to understand how we could actually support young men who were struggling both in school, and some of them actually had dropped out of school. We did a one-year study, and we wanted to understand how is it that we could use a social-emotional approach to actually support them in their own lives, that they can make better decisions, and that we can have the kind of conversations that actually make a difference in terms of their navigation skills. Some of these young men, when they came to our program, were homeless. For young people, homelessness is not like we think about homelessness with veterans, right? Homelessness for young people is, I stay with my grandmama, right? Or I'm staying with my friend. or this week I'm staying with my auntie, right? Homelessness is a shelter vulnerability, right? So even though they don't consider themselves homeless, they don't have a regular place to go. So some of these young people came to us homeless. Some of them came to us who had been to jail. And we wanted to work with them in what we called a healing circle, a radical healing circle, to use some techniques that I have been using for the past 15 to 20 years with African American young people. And we met every Wednesday night at a community college. We met at Laney Community College, and we had a healing circle. In the healing circle, basically, we did two things. The first thing we wanted to do was provide a sense of, we know that they came to us stressed, and most of them, when they came to us, self-medicated. They used marijuana. And so we wanted to give them some techniques to actually address their sense of stress. And we wanted to have conversations about the issues that they were dealing with. We tried meditation, and it didn't work, just to be honest with you. One of the things that they said to us when we used meditation, we sat quietly. We didn't call it meditation. We called it quiet sitting. They said to us, you know what you're asking us to do, Dr. Ginwright? He said, when we leave here, we feel like, when we're out on the street, we feel like an antelope or a deer, and that there's a lion or a tiger chasing us all the time. And what you're asking us to do is to calm down. And actually, by calming down, it makes us more vulnerable to the issues that are in the neighborhood that we have to face. We have to be on point all the time. And when we come here and you ask us to meditate and calm down and reflect, that actually makes us we don't have the acuity, they didn't use this word, to actually make the best decisions in the context of traumatic environments. And so we learned quite quickly that we had to change some of the techniques that we were using. That while we understand that meditation is an important factor in their health and well-being, that there are other ways that we had to use to actually facilitate that. So the argument generally goes like this, that the context of poverty actually threatens social-emotional skills and social-emotional awareness, that trauma and violence threaten character development and skills. What we found actually was the opposite, is that it wasn't that young men were lacking social-emotional skills and social-emotional awareness and character traits. In fact, it was because of the context of poverty that they had a sense of self-control. It was because of the context of poverty that they had a sense of self-confidence. It was because of the conditions that they faced in their neighborhoods that they had a sense of grit. So it wasn't they were lacking social-emotional navigation skills. It's that the context that they had, had to navigate actually facilitated it. So we concluded in our study a couple of things. We needed to bridge our understanding of building social-emotional health and what we call healing. So it's not just about social-emotional states, but it's about the capacity to become well again. That we have to understand that the conditions that young people face do harm to their social-emotional states. And part of the healing process is getting them to understand the broader social issues, building a sense of collectivity, so that they can actually confront and change some of the conditions in their schools. We call that process radical healing. Radical healing has 5 parts. We call it 5 principles of radical healing. That is, placing culture at the center of discussions and strategies in schools and after-school programs. The simple question about what does it mean to be African American? The question about what does it mean to be Latino? Right? That is conversations that make race explicit. Now, what this requires is oftentimes a challenge for teachers of color, because it requires that white teachers have a comfort level about engaging and talking about race. Right? But this process of culture makes a significant difference in being able to connect with young people. The second is agency. That is, how are young people engaged with actually transforming the very conditions of their lives? The third, we're more familiar with, which is relationships, building healthy relationships with young people. The fourth is meaning, having meaning and meaningful engagement. And those are activities like we saw earlier, activities that bring meaning to young people's lives so that what they're learning is not decontextualized, right? So it might mean what kind of project can we instigate, or what kind of project can we talk about that might address police violence in our schools, right? And the third is achievement, or the fifth is achievement, right? The sense that young people can have the capacity to master a set of skills. Phil came to this group. He was one of the young men that was homeless, and after our 6-month process, Phil decided that he wanted to start his own business while he was in high school. And so when he came to us, he was homeless. But what he did was he started working at a Goodwill, and what he would do was save money and use the money to start his own T-shirt company. This is one of his first T-shirt companies. Now, obviously, it wasn't enough money to actually sustain himself, but what it showed us was that the process that we used allowed him to make better decisions and allowed him to actually use the very little resources he has to actually engage in some kind of economic development. So I want to end here, that when we think about social-emotional learning, right, that it is both a function, social-emotional learning is both a function of the external opportunities and our internal capacity to hope. And both of these are inextricably tied to one another, creating an inextricable elixir of possibilities. We have to understand that these things make a significant difference when we combine a radical healing approach that allows for young people to hope and see the world differently, but also engage them in connecting and changing the very conditions of their lives. Thank you.